Esher, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book 3. Written by Felicity Heaton. Narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 23. It had been 3 days since Esher had brought her back, and gods, the anger hadn't gone anywhere. It simmered in his veins, leashed but still there, not satisfied by her return. He wouldn't be satisfied until the demon who had killed her met the same fate, suffered at his hands, and was torn apart by his power. Relief that Aiko was back with him came and went, and sometimes he couldn't breathe until he saw her again, found and saw with his own eyes that she was safe. Alive. It had been easier until yesterday, because he had only needed to head the handful of strides to his room and check on her where she rested in his bed. But yesterday she had decided she was strong enough to leave his room, had asked him to walk with her, and had finally smiled for the first time since she had come back, when he had practically smothered her, walking so close to her that they constantly brushed each other. He couldn't help himself. He couldn't bring himself to be more than an inch from her, needed to feel her and be aware that she was alive, safe, well. Well. He wasn't sure he could apply that word to her yet. She was low in spirit, her smiles rare now, and her eyes holding pain sometimes before she noticed him, and it drifted away. Her thoughts weighed her down, had her silent during mealtimes when he came to sit with her in his room, keeping her company. The first day she had been back, she hadn't said more than a handful of words to him, hadn't smiled once, and he had started to fear she would never be the same again, would continue to grow distant from him until she receded so deeply into herself that she was lost to him. When he had been called for punishment for speaking the language of the underworld on Earth, and had gone to tell her where he was going, not wanting her to worry about his absence because Diamond had come to protect her in his stead, she had come alive. She had shot to her feet and pleaded with him not to go, had come close to convincing him to do as she wished, and she had shown him the depth of the love that she still held for him in her heart. She hadn't been afraid because he wouldn't be around to protect her. She had been afraid he would be vulnerable by leaving the mansion grounds, would come under attack. He had vowed that he would be safe because he was stepping from the mansion straight to Olympus, but it had still taken time to calm her enough that he could bring himself to leave her. Nemesis had demanded 100 extra lashes for his tardiness. Esher hadn't felt them, or the other 1,000. He had thought about Aiko constantly, desperate to return to her, worried about her. When he had returned, he had managed to convince himself to wash first rather than head straight to her, had borne the pain of wearing a t-shirt over the fresh wounds for her. He didn't want her to see them. She was suffering enough without witnessing what Nemesis had done to him as punishment for speaking his native tongue, in order to go to the underworld to bring back her soul. She would blame his pain on herself, and she already had too much pain in her heart to bear. He wanted to take some of that pain unto himself for her, tried to steal slivers of it whenever she was feeling bright enough to spend time with him. He stared at the empty bed in his room, the white covers rumpled and pushed aside. Where had she gone? He followed the stepping stones across the gravel, strode over the arched crimson wooden bridge that spanned the pond, and wove through the garden, following his heart. It whispered where she was. He rounded a bend between 2 stone lanterns and found her sitting on the large gray boulder, her bare feet dangling above the grass, her eyes locked on the cherry tree and her profile to him. His robe swamped her, the black cloth wrapped tightly around her tiny form, reaching her ankles. Below her feet, blue poppies bloomed. He looked at the tree, frowned as the blossoms that had been faded were bright with life again, almost glowing with it as they danced in the gentle, warm breeze. His mother. She was watching over Aiko for him, trying to soothe her troubled soul with something Aiko found beautiful, giving her something bright in this world to draw her away from the darkness of her death. Aiko looked across at him, and relief hit him hard when he saw her brown eyes were brighter today, and there was finally color in her pale cheeks again, a dash of pink that darkened as he stared at her. "I thought the tree was done blooming." She glanced back at it, and her lips curled in a faint smile. "It probably was." He looked at it and then crossed the patch of grass to her, and she frowned at his bare feet. He didn't need to look to see what was happening. The way her eyes widened told him. She lifted them to his, searching them for an explanation. He stooped, plucked one of the poppies that were blooming around him, and tucked her black hair behind her ear, fixing the poppy there. It was her color, too. "Mother," he said. Aiko shimmied to her left. He took a seat in the space she offered, and the moment she pressed against him, he couldn't stop himself from lifting her onto his lap and wrapping his arms around her, keeping her angled in a way that allowed her to see the flowers and the cherry blossoms. Her black robe blended into his jeans and shirt. "She's a goddess of nature. Persephone." He tucked Aiko a little closer to him and wanted to groan as she snuggled into his arms, the pleasure of feeling her in them a soothing balm to his battered heart. "It makes sense." Aiko leaned back, setting her head on his shoulder, her temple pressing against his neck. "You and your brothers all control elements of nature." That was true. Persephone had power over more than just nature, though, balanced Hades in his power over death. Aiko was proof of that. He had only realized it yesterday when he had found her in the garden in this spot and had berated her for being out of bed so soon. She had countered that she felt strong enough to leave her bed. She had looked tired, though, worn down, pale, and he hadn't been convinced. When he had tried to make her return to her room, seizing her hand, she had stood firm, unmoving. He had looked at her then, really looked at her, and had seen the poppies blooming around her feet, and the glow that lit her eyes as she told him flat that she wanted to walk the garden. She was stronger than before. It wasn't only her soul's journey to the underworld and back again that had affected her. He had the feeling that while her soul had been there, his mother had found it. Aware of his pain and his love for the mortal, and that he would come for her soul. But he would always worry something would happen to her again, because she was weak and vulnerable. Persephone had done what she could to ease his fears. She had blessed Aiko's soul. His mother had made her strong enough to walk in his world as immortal as he was. It had soothed the worst of his fears, but had done nothing to crush the other ones that weren't so easily vanquished and would always be a part of him, because he loved her. He would always worry about her, afraid of putting her in danger, just as he always worried about his brothers. "What are you thinking?" she murmured on a contented sigh and stroked her fingers along his arm, back and forth, calming him. She was reading him again, picking up his turbulent emotions. He pressed his cheek against her forehead. "I'm just worried about you." She tilted her head towards him and back, pressed her lips to his chin. He turned and kissed her, smoothed his palm across her cheek and held her in place as he savored her lips. Her kiss made all the sweeter by the way it relaxed her, seemed to chase away her somber thoughts too. She stilled against his lips. "Your brothers are coming." They were? He frowned as he felt the first one appear, closely followed by another. He had thought they had more time before the meeting. Aiko slipped from his lap and he caught her wrist. She looked down at it and then up into his eyes. "You don't have to be there." He held her hand. It trembled slightly in his, betraying her nerves, but she nodded. "I'm ready. I want to be part of the meeting." She wasn't ready. She was pushing herself for his sake, for the sake of his brothers and their worlds. When he had told her Marek had called a meeting, she had asked to attend, had insisted when he had tried to deny her, telling her to wait in his room or in the garden. "I have information." She twisted her hand in his, slipping her fingers over his palm and taking hold of his hand instead, and tugged on it. "I think I should be dressed, though." That had him moving, because he was damned if his brothers were going to see her in just his robe. She didn't protest when he scooped her up into his arms and carried her like a princess through the garden. She looped her arms around his neck and rested her head on his shoulder. "I'll cook curry rice later," he said to fill the pleasant silence. "We can eat at the table today." "I'd like that." She wriggled closer, her sigh telling him just how much she liked the idea. "I'd like a bath, too." He stopped dead, heart slamming against his chest at the thought of bathing her. He crushed it a second later. She was strong enough to bathe herself. "You can have a shower." He looked down at her and she frowned at him.
"I want to float on the water."
She almost pouted when he went to shake his head, and he sighed again, an exasperated one this time. "The water is too hot. What if you faint?" She hit him with another smile. Two so close together. He wasn't sure he could take it, his heart doing a flip at the sight of it, and the thought she might be getting better after all, might pull through and expel the darkness that lingered in her soul, filling it with light again.
"You'll be there to save me."
She meant the words lightly, teasingly, and damn temptingly, but they hit him hard, left him cold. "I'm sorry," he croaked and held her closer, crushed her against him and clung to her, his fingers pressing into her ribs and her knee. His stomach churned, acid boiling in it as he saw her falling, failed to catch her in time, and watched her die. She pressed her cheek to his, and he wasn't sure if it was her tears or his that wetted his skin.
"Help me forget,"
she whispered, a desperate note to her voice.
"I want to make new memories, happier memories. I want to fill my head with them so I can forget the bad ones."
Gods, he could do that for her. They would make 1,000,000 memories, one so bright they filled her heart with light again, drove out the darkness and brought her nothing but happiness and a reason to smile, to laugh. He nodded stiffly. "I could do with some of that myself." Because every time he closed his eyes, whenever fatigue crept up on him and he fell asleep, he saw her falling, saw himself failing her, watched her die. He felt Valen nearby, braced himself for a smart-ass comment, but when he looked at his brother, Valen averted his blue eyes and turned away, giving him some time alone with Iko. Didn't even mention the fact Esher was crying like a fucking baby. He buried his face in Iko's neck and held her, just stood there in the middle of the bridge and held her, not giving a shit if his brothers all saw him, or that he was making them wait. Iko said she was ready to speak with them, but he wasn't. Karis was going to tear him a new one. Everyone was going to kick up a fuss. Or they were going to tread on eggshells around him as if he would flip his switch if they said a word out of place. He wasn't sure he could bear it. He just wanted to be alone with Iko. She brushed her fingers through his hair, teasing the short back of it, and then the sides, and then the curve of his ear, and pressed kisses to his throat and cheek that pushed away the pain, had him focusing on her and the present, and that she was in his arms. Warm, safe, alive. Immortal. He kissed her again and groaned as she met it with a passionate one, her lips fierce against his, filled with desperation that called at him, made him want to drown in her until they were both smiling again, light filling their souls and their pain forgotten.
"Your brothers are waiting,"
she murmured against his lips, her heart telling him that she didn't care, that she didn't want to end this moment yet. "Let them wait." He kissed her again, held her closer, and gave her what she needed, a reminder that she was alive. They both were, and nothing was going to change that. Nothing was going to separate them again. When she was breathless and panting, he eased back, slowing the kiss and bringing her back down. She broke away from his lips, nuzzled his nose with her own, and whispered,
"Thank you."
He didn't deserve that, so he didn't respond to it. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers and growled, "Gods, I fucking love you." She giggled. Sweet ambrosia, it rushed through him like fire, lit him up and chased out the lingering cold.
"I love you too."
She pressed her lips to his, but her kiss was brief, sweet, too damn chaste now she had him fired up.
"So can I have that bath later?"
Who was he to deny her? If she wanted to float on water, she would float on water. Whatever she wanted, she got. He nodded. "I'll keep an eye on you." But that was all he would do. As much as he wanted to give in to his need of her, ached to kiss her and touch her and make love with her, he would hold back and just bathe with her. She wasn't ready for anything else yet. He felt sure of it, and he didn't want to push her. He carried her into his room, set her down, and closed the door panels, shutting the world out. She tortured him as she shed his robe, revealing her bare curves, and he averted his eyes, not sure he could bear it. He knew she wanted his eyes on her, that it made her feel alive, just as his kiss had. But he had a damned meeting to attend, and he was in danger of forgetting all about it. If he looked at her while she dressed in the clothes Megan had brought for her, a faded pair of blue jeans she had to roll up at the ankles, a dark pink camisole that hugged her breasts, and a deep blue sweater, he might be tempted to strip them all back off her and make a better memory with her, one he hoped might put a smile on her face.
Ready.
She slipped her hand into his. She wasn't. He could feel her shaking, could sense her nerves. He squeezed her hand and gazed down into her eyes. If it gets too much, if you want a break, just say. Promise me you'll say. She managed another smile.
I promise.
He huffed. Let's do this then. Chapter 24. Esher led Aiko from his room, keeping hold of her hand. He wasn't going to release it until the meeting was done and they were alone again, and even then he was only going to let it go so he could wrap his arms around her. She walked with her chin tipped up, her eyes bright and a confidence in her step that conveyed the courage she had found, one she had probably been gradually building up all day to get it to the point where she felt ready to speak about what had happened to her. Gods, he was unraveling, falling apart as she grew stronger, each day tearing at him as it restored her. His own courage faltered as he neared the main room of the house and heard his brothers talking. When he walked in, they would all stop and stare, would bring up what he had done, might even lash out at him, or berate him in Karis's case, and he steeled himself preparing for it. He entered ahead of Aiko, ready to weather everything his brothers threw at him. Valen laughed over something Cal had said, both of them lounging on the couch beside each other, no longer looking like each other as they used to. When the fuck had Valen dyed his hair violet? Megan giggled, her chocolate eyes bright with amusement.
And then I told him he'd lost the bet and he had to pay up.
He wasn't happy. Aries, sitting on the armchair beneath her and playing cushion, a wall of black beneath her blue jeans and crimson t-shirt, jabbed his fingers into her ribs, eliciting a squeak from her as she wriggled. I'll win next time. Gods, it all felt so normal. It hit Esher hard, shaking him, knocking him back on his heels as he absorbed the sight of his brothers gathered around the TV, joking and laughing with each other. Valen slung his arm around Ava, their choice of black combat clothing making them blend into each other, and pulled her to him. She smiled at him, her short black hair swaying to flash the electric blue stripes in it, as she leaned towards his brother, landing a hand on his chest. Her cerulean eyes were bright, her light voice laced with her thick Italian accent as she said,
Maybe we should paint your nails next.
Valen made a face. Diamond laughed. I think pink is his color, really. That had Valen turning his scowl on Diamond. Karis looked over the back of the couch at Esher and rose onto his feet. Join us. He eyed his brother and cautiously led Aiko around the couch. She settled on it beside Marek, and Esher went with her, placing himself between her and his brother, keeping an eye on Karis, still wary of his older brother even as he moved away, long black-clad legs carrying him to the other side of Aries near the TV. Marek leaned forwards and looked across at Aiko. You look well. How are you feeling? She lit up the room with another smile, but Esher could feel her strain, the darkness beginning to press back down on her as she did her best to deny it.
Better. Esher has been taking care of me.
I'll bet, Valen sniggered, and Esher glared at him. Ignore the idiot, Aries put in and wrapped his arms around Megan's stomach. We're all glad you're all right.
Thank you.
She brought her bare feet up onto the couch and clutched Esher's hand.
I know you took care of me.
Aries' rugged face and earthy eyes gained an uncomfortable edge as he shrugged. Megan did most of the work. Megan flinched and elbowed Aries in the ribs. He grunted and glared at the back of her head. Aiko didn't seem too bothered by Aries' careless words, ones that might have reminded her of the mess she had been in, so Esher let his brother live another day. Marek, you called this meeting. Karis paced a few strides towards the other couch and then stopped himself. and Esher frowned as he caught the way his green eyes darkened, black swirling around their edges before he got the better of himself. Marek had done something to anger Karis. What? Esher looked at his other brothers, but no one seemed to know what had put a bee in Karis's bonnet. And then Marek huffed, raked fingers through his short wavy brown hair, and spoke. I received a message from Olympus, and Karis's mood made sense. Enyo had visited Marek. Karis paced again, his strides clipped, his eyes dark as he twisted the silver band on his right thumb around it with his fingers. Her brother can feel something coming, something big. I asked for more information. When Marek said that, Karis's gaze whipped to him, and for a moment Esher thought he would speak. He went back to pacing, his emotions disappearing one by one until his handsome face was a blank mask. It's hardly information. We all know whatever is coming is building to a crescendo. It doesn't take an informant from Olympus to tell us that. We can see it in the other world. Esher couldn't blame his brother for being angry with Enyo, or Marek. It was low of her to speak with Marek and not Karis. Heartless. She must have known Karis would be aware that she had visited Marek the moment he came into contact with his brother again. Marek sat forwards. I told her to get more information. She said she would do her best. I told her to speak with you. Karis turned on him with a snarl, flashing fangs, a shadow flitting across his face that had all the females in the room gasping, and then he disappeared. Fucking idiot, Valen muttered, fielded the glare Marek shot him, and shot one right back. Don't ever fucking tell him you tried to force her to speak with him. What kind of dumb shit move is that? Marek looked at his other brothers when everyone nodded in agreement. It's a bit of a dick move, Diamond said, rolling his shoulders when Marek frowned at him. How would you feel if I told you I just tried to force someone to speak with you, someone you cared about, that she had to be forced to speak with you, and even then she didn't want to do it? Ares shook his head. He's going to be pissed for a while. Cal flashed 2 thumbs up. Great job. Now I get to deal with him. You guys really need to think about the consequences before you open your mouths. You don't have to live with him. Think we should continue without him? Esher wasn't sure because Karis had never flipped like that and left a meeting before. Something was up with his brother, something more than just Enyo's visit to Marek upsetting him. Is this because I went home? He looked at each of his brothers in turn, relieved when everyone shook their head. Nah. Ares pulled Megan closer to him. He's been off for a few days, and now I know why. He can sense her when she's in this world, you know? Marek's earthy eyes widened. I didn't. Damn her. I told her to go away. I don't know why she always has to bother me. Esher felt for him. He had done nothing to deserve Karis's wrath, but he was going to be feeling it for a while. Anything turn up in the research about the Valkyrie? Ares rubbed his palms over Megan's thighs, and she clucked her tongue at him and slapped them to stop him from teasing her. Valkyrie? Esher looked to him. I got hit by one in New York. Wraith showed up and said she was meant to be somewhere else. I figured he meant Tokyo, that she was the one after you. And then we figured out Aiko was being targeted that night at the club, not us. And I came here with Megan to protect her. Ares' brown eyes flickered with golden red flakes as his mood darkened. I'm sorry I wasn't quick enough. He shook his head in time with Aiko.
The one who took me looked like Esher, smelled like Esher, felt like you.
She looked at him, nerves in her eyes, colored with regret.
I should have known, but I was worried you had come to see me, and I went with you, with the demon, so I could convince you to go home.
He smoothed his palm across her cheek and shook his head again, holding her gaze. It wasn't your fault. I shouldn't have sent you home. I should have realized they would go after you and asked you to go with Diamond. But the thought of her being around another of his brothers, alone with them, had tormented him so much he had refused to go through with it.
When I realized it wasn't you, I tried reading them. They tried to make me contact you, and I refused when they told me they wanted to use me as a collar to control you.
She squeezed his hand so tight it actually hurt, and tears lined her black lashes. It would work, too. He would do anything for her. Anything. All someone had to do was get their hands on her, and he would do whatever they wanted. But they didn't have her. He did, and he would protect her.
They tried to make me, and the phone repelled them.
Her voice hitched.
And then it all happened so fast.
He pressed his palm to her face, drew her to him, and rubbed her cheek with his heart aching as her pain went through him. That's enough. You don't have to say any more. She nodded and then shook her head, sniffed back her tears, and drew back from him.
The demon. I read her thoughts.
Her eyes searched his, and he stared into them, reeling from what she had said.
They were hazy, but she was afraid. She feared someone, another woman. She believed the woman would kill her if she failed, because you were vital, a key.
To the gates? He exchanged a look with his brothers. As far as they knew, the demons still believed the amulets he and his brothers wore when opening the gates were the keys to them, and what they needed to get their hands on. But what if they knew the keys were in fact he and his brothers? If his enemy caught Aiko, he would open the gate for them, and so much more. He would destroy the gatekeeper guarding the other side of it so they could enter the underworld. One look at Ares and Valen, and he knew his brothers felt the same. They would do whatever it took to protect their females. So why were they targeting him in particular? It had to be more than his ability to open the gate. He looked at Aiko, and the reason hit him. They knew all about him, enough for the shapeshifter to mimic him, which meant they knew his history, and how deeply he hated Hades for forcing him to live in this world filled with the humans he despised so much. They wanted to play on that hatred, to bring it to the fore, to unleash his other side, one they could control with promises of retribution, a side of himself that wanted to watch this world burn and rule the hellish remains of it. Their plans had hit a bump when he had met Aiko. Now, rather than using his other side to control him, they were going to try to use her. With his power over one of the two dominant elements in the world, and his loathing of this realm, and anger towards his father, he was the perfect candidate for joining their ranks. He could let them in the gate, could destroy the damn thing with little more than a thought, and then this world with his next one. He felt Aiko's steady gaze on him, her thumb stroking the length of his, and focused on her, using her presence beside him, that love he could feel in her and her worry to calm him. He wouldn't be used as a pawn against his brothers in this war. He wouldn't destroy his home. He would destroy his enemy. He would hunt down the one who had tried to take Aiko from him, the one who had hurt her, and he would butcher them. Aiko lifted her hand and rested it against his cheek, drew his head around to face hers, and her eyes met his. He fell into their dark chocolate depths, felt calm sweep over him again when he saw in them how much she needed him, how badly shaken she still was by everything that happened. It was a struggle, but he managed to tamp down the urge to hunt, to paint his face in the blood of the bitch who had killed her. When he was level again, the hunger to hunt back to a faint gnawing in his heart, he nodded. She turned back to the others.
The woman didn't want to kill me. She tried to stop me from falling.
That did nothing to improve his mood. She did, though. His words were little more than a dark snarl. Even if she didn't want to do it, it happened. And gods, if she had remained in the grip of that demon, she would have had a worse existence, would have suffered more. He knew that. He had lived it before. He had watched someone he cared about tortured and maimed, and eventually killed by wretches in some sick desire to torment him and make him suffer. He didn't want to think about what the demon would have done to Aiko if she hadn't fallen and changed their plans. He hated thinking about her dying, saw it too many times each day, knew it would haunt him for decades to come. But she was back now and stronger because of it, safer because of it. Her death tormented them both. But gods, maybe it was better than the pain she would have gone through if she had lived. Pain that would have been both physical and emotional. A torture designed to keep him on a firm leash, desperate to do whatever they wanted in order to save her. We'll get her, Ares said, his voice as dark as Esher's had been, a promise in his fiery eyes as he looked at Esher. She will pay. We'll make sure of that. Her, the Wraith, and that fucking Valkyrie. Esher had forgotten about the Valkyrie. Dealing with the shapeshifter would prove tricky enough. Adding a Valkyrie into the mix would make the coming fight dangerous for everyone involved. They were powerful, protected by charms stronger than the ones he and his brothers could make.
But we just have to rip those cuffs off her and you can take her down, right?
Megan twisted at the waist to see Ares. Vambraces, he corrected and nodded, and relief speared Esher's soul as he realized they already knew what to target on the Valkyrie in order to weaken her.
What about the other woman?
Ava said, and Ares shifted his gaze to her. She glanced at Esher and then Marek.
Benares. The Wraith said to him that he never understood why she favored him so much.
It might be the Valkyrie he was talking about, Marek offered. Ares shook his head. She didn't strike me as the boss. The Wraith treated her in a way that made it clear he was senior to her, pulled her kicking and screaming through that portal of his. And we're thinking he's junior to the female he mentioned? Cal leaned forwards to rest his elbows on his black combats-clad knees. So there's another female. Esher nodded at the same time as Ares, and felt just as happy about that, judging by his brother's grim expression. One who wants to get her hands on the underworld. Valen frowned at his knees and then lifted troubled blue eyes to land on Ares. When Benares died, he said she had promised they would rule this world, him and his sister Jin. Not the underworld, this one. Benares hadn't been interested in the gates either. He had wanted dominion over the mortal world. I doubt a Valkyrie would want to rule the underworld, and the Wraith would be more interested in feeding on souls in this one, Ares growled, his face darkening. Which I'm guessing means they've all been promised something if this succeeds and this female, the one they keep mentioning, gets what she wants. Her hands on our home. Everyone fell silent, the air thick with tension that pressed down on Esher, as he mulled over everything and kept drawing the same conclusion. We need to capture the shapeshifter. 6 of the hardest words he had ever had to say. He didn't want to capture her. He wanted to kill her after she had suffered. It was necessary, though. He could see it as he looked at his brothers. The Wraith had killed Amori before Ares and Diamond had a chance to convince him to say anything. And Benares had died before he had revealed anything, too. If they were going to stand a chance at stopping the calamity from happening, if they were going to have a shot at winning this war, they needed intel on their enemy. That meant reining in his anger enough that he could capture the shapeshifter. It was going to be hard. Even now he wanted to kill her, wanted to see her blood on his hands and painted on his face as he went after the Wraith and the Valkyrie, and whoever was the mastermind behind everything. Capturing her alive isn't going to be a cakewalk. Valen eyed him. We don't know whether her power can affect us like it affected Aiko. It was going to be dangerous. He could already feel that, was already uneasy, on edge. If the shapeshifter knew him the way he thought she did, and he was susceptible to her illusions, she would try to screw with his head. Her physical appearance wasn't the only thing under her control. She could cast illusions to manipulate her surroundings. He screwed his eyes shut, not wanting to think about the things she might use against him. He had to do this. You won't be alone, Diamond said, and Esher opened his eyes and met his ice blue ones across the room. I'll be with you. Me too, Ares growled. Count me in, Valen grinned. No. Esher shook his head and they shot him daggers. He refused to back down. He didn't want them involved, didn't want them away from their females. It was bad enough that he was contemplating putting his own little butterfly in the firing line. They both shouted at him, Valen shooting onto his feet and Ares struggling as Megan kept him pinned, their words blurring in his ears. I need you to protect your females. When he said that, they both fell silent, their struggles ceasing, and grumbled a few choice things beneath their breaths. Valen sank onto the couch and Ares glared at Esher, both of them making it clear they were pissed at him for benching them. Marek, I need you to speak with... Esher cut himself off when Karis reappeared, face a mask of calm now, no trace of black in his emerald eyes. They were cold again, emotionless. Empty. "What did I miss?" he said, as if nothing had happened, and beside him Aiko frowned and leaned forwards, trying to read his brother. He squeezed her hand, telling her silently to leave him be. He appreciated her wanting to help him understand what was playing on his brother's mind, but Karis might hurt her if he realized she was probing his thoughts, and he didn't want to fight with his brothers today. "Karis, I know it takes a lot out of you, but I need your shadows." Esher ignored the frown his older brother leveled on him. "I need you and Marek to work together." Karis looked as if he wanted to glare at Marek, but he nodded, keeping his eyes away from him. Esher was pushing his luck pairing them, but hopefully it would help Karis get over his anger. Besides, Esher was damned if he was going to have Karis lay his hands on Aiko, and not only because his brother seemed too unpredictable right now. Marek was the better choice for teleporting her. If Karis touched her, Esher would want to go after them and rearrange his face so it was a little less handsome. "I'm staying here then." Ares tossed him a look that warned him not to argue. "I'll protect the gate if I have to, or the other gates. Megan will be safe in the mansion within the wards, and we might need her to heal us." "Me too. We'll take care of the gates while you deal with this bitch." Valen wrapped his arm around Ava's slender shoulders. "Ava can help." Cal raised his hand, the tip of his blonde ponytail fluttering as he sat forwards on the edge of the couch, his voice holding a hint of a snarl that spoke of his temper. "What about me?" He thought everyone had forgotten him when Esher was counting on him. "You're coming with me." Esher looked from him to Diamond. "I'll need all of our powers combined." Ares and Valen kicked off again. "Diamond I get, but Cal?" Valen snapped, and Cal grabbed him by his hair, dragged him into a headlock and rubbed it. "I'm as powerful as the rest of you." Callistos grinned as he pressed his knuckles harder into Valen's skull. "He's less destructive, too, and far less likely to let his power control him." That earned Esher a glare, but he didn't take it back or apologize. Valen and Ares were the two most likely to be seduced by their power and cause damage to the area, and he intended to have this battle in a very public arena. Valen huffed. "But it's Cal. He's the baby." He was Valen's junior by only 80 years, and just 38 years younger than Diamond, the second youngest. He wasn't a baby, and Valen knew it. Was saying it to ruffle his feathers, and it worked. "I'm always on the fucking bench. It's about time I got off." A flash of regret crossed Callisto's face, and he opened his mouth to amend what he had said, but it was too late. Valen grinned. "You a virgin still?" "Fuck off." Cal didn't even move, but Valen went flying across the room, his ankles clipping the low dining table as he shot towards the kitchen. He hit an invisible wall before he smashed into the kitchen one, striking it with so much force he grunted and his arms and legs flew forwards. He didn't drop to the floor. He struggled in thin air as he recovered, kicking and clawing, trying to punch his way out of Callisto's hold. It wasn't going to happen. Valen's eyes brightened and sparks chased between his fingers. "Don't even think about it," Esher snarled and shot to his feet. He turned to Cal. "Put him down or you're on the bench too." "When did you get so chatty and bossy?" Cal huffed and dropped Valen, who landed on his feet and stormed towards the couch on the warpath. "Text me the details." Callistos disappeared, leaving Valen growling at the spot where he had been. "Little shit." Valen stalked around the couch, snatched Ava's wrist, and growled as he pulled her into his arms. "I need angry sex." Her eyes darkened at that, and she wrapped her arms around him as they disappeared. Karis pulled a disgusted face and teleported, and Marek followed suit. "You'll be okay?" Diamond said, and Esher nodded. "Call if you need me." He stepped, leaving swirls of black smoke in his wake. Esher met Ares' gaze, nodded again to let him know he really was fine, and breathed a sigh of relief as his brother disappeared with Megan, and he was finally alone with Aiko. "Sorry," he muttered, and wondered if he would ever stop feeling the need to apologize for his brothers. She smiled softly.
"What did Callistos mean?"
He sighed and leaned back into the cream couch as he slipped his arm around her and pulled her against him, savoring the feel of her as she settled her hand on his chest and tucked her knees against his thigh. I used to be quiet, distant in a way, before you. He brushed the backs of his knuckles across her cheek, looked deep into her eyes, and marveled at how he had changed because of her, how she had drawn out the side of himself that had been locked away for longer than he could remember, a side he had thought he would never see again. She nestled close to him, her fingers playing across his chest, circling the buttons of his shirt and driving him mad with need.
What do you want me to do?
He half smiled at that, should have known she would see through him and would be aware that she had a part in his plan. How are you feeling? He whispered, and brushed his lips across her brow, pressed a kiss to it, and breathed her in. He didn't want to put her in danger again, and she wouldn't be. He would make sure of that.
Strong. In body. Not as tired as I thought I might be.
She sounded confused by that, and he kept his theory about what his mother had done to her soul to himself, for now. When she was stronger, when this was over, he would tell her. Strong enough to help me? He angled his head so he could see her face. She jerked away from him, sitting bolt upright, and nodded.
I want to help.
It was strange to see that flash of hunger in her eyes, such gentle eyes. It unsettled him because he knew the source of it. She wanted revenge. He wanted to refuse her, but he couldn't, not when that desire stemmed not only from her own suffering, but from a need to protect him. She didn't want him to suffer, wanted to make sure the demon couldn't hurt him, or turn him against his brothers and everyone he loved. And gods, he loved her for it. We're only going to make it known you're alive. I'll walk you home, and Marek and Karis will make sure you're safe. As soon as the demon shows, they'll take you back to the mansion. She nodded, and her brow wrinkled as her eyes searched his.
Are you going to capture her?
He could see she didn't want him to do that she was afraid of being in the same building as the demon, and it made him want to kill the bitch and forget questioning her. But he couldn't. They needed information. But it wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be dangerous, and there was a chance he might not be the victor, that she might prove too powerful for him, or might do something to make him snap. He framed Aiko's face and stared into her eyes, grounding himself to push away from his fears, clawing back his strength and pulling up his courage, using the sight of her to vanquish all of his doubts, because winning was the only option. Losing didn't even factor in when winning meant seeing Aiko again. I'm gonna try. Chapter 25. Aiko caught the fear in Esher's blue eyes, a flare of it that he tried to conceal from her. It rang through her veins, as clear as her own feelings, together with something else. Need. He needed her as fiercely as she needed him. It had been building inside her since her return, a steady welling that had come on so gradually that she hadn't noticed it until today, when he had come to her, and it had felt as if she had seen him with clear eyes at last. And he had been beautiful, breathtaking. When he had come to her at the cherry tree, all of his feelings on show for her, none of them hidden, and the light had played over him. The peace she had been feeling had grown, completed by his presence, and it had dawned on her that she loved him, truly loved him. It was deep, unconditional, infinite, a love she knew would never die. It would only ever grow stronger. Through every trial they faced, every setback and every victory, all of it would mold that love into a stronger form. She had never realized love could be so powerful, so consuming, and so beautiful. Fear of what was to come flowed in her veins too, colliding with everything that had happened to rouse a need in her, a deep and desperate desire to lose herself in a moment and forget the rest of the world existed. She wanted to narrow everything down to only them, and that feeling grew stronger as she stared into his eyes, saw it reflected in them. He needed it too, ached as she did with a desire to forget, to push tomorrow aside and focus on today, on the here and now. She wanted to crush the darkness too, to let light back in and feel alive again, to forget what lay behind her and focus on the now, on the fact they were both alive. He didn't resist as she captured his lips, or when she crawled onto his lap, settling herself astride his thighs, the position making her remember when they had made love in the bath. He lowered his hands from her back to her bottom, exhaled hard as he drew her against him and angled his head, kissing her deeper, sending the rest of the world and her worries drifting to the back of her mind. A thrill chased through her, a surge of desire stirred by the way he pulled her closer still, pressed her against his hips, and had that moment in the bath rushing back into her mind. The memory of him inside her, their bodies joined, had the heat of passion flaring hot in her veins, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and pushed her fingers through his hair, clutching him to her as she kissed him, tangled her tongue with his, and lost herself. He groaned and swept her up into his arms, tearing a squeak from her as he stood. She held him tighter, kept kissing him as he carried her, each step making her desire flare hotter. Her blood run quicker, heart beat faster. An ache started low in her belly, flames licking outwards over her body from it, making her restless in his arms. He moaned again as she gripped the back of his head and raised herself in his arms so she could kiss him as deeply as she desired. When he reached his room, he set her down, his mouth still fused with hers, his kiss turning wild and deliciously desperate as he skimmed his hands down her sides, up again and over her breasts. She lifted her arms when he grabbed the hem of her navy jumper, tugged it up, and broke the kiss for only as long as it took to get it over her head. He tossed it aside and groaned again as she fumbled with the buttons of his black shirt, some of them snagging in her haste to strip him, her need to have her hands on his bare flesh again. He helped her, dealing with the last few buttons, and shirked the garment as he continued to kiss her, his breath coming faster now, rising to match the pace of hers. She moaned as she pressed her palms to his chest, frustrated as she met cotton, and slid them down, that heat blazing hotter as his muscles tensed, delighting her fingers as they traversed each powerful ridge. When she reached the hem, she dipped beneath it, and moaned all over again at the feel of his soft, warm skin, stretched tight over hard muscles. He shuddered and stilled, breathing ragged against her lips as she explored him, charted every muscle and each scar, feeling them on his skin. "Iko," he groaned, the sound rough and low, strained as he trembled. It was too much for him. She knew that, because it was too much for her, too. Had that need rising to startling heights, where she felt as if she was losing control, would die all over again if she didn't kiss and lick every inch of his bare flesh, and satisfy the need rolling through her. She pushed his dark gray t-shirt up, exposing his stomach to her eyes, and trembled at the sight of him as he pulled it off, the action of raising his arms above his head making his muscles even more pronounced. She leaned towards him and kissed the scar on his right side, and he froze with his arms in the air, tangled in his t-shirt, his breath rushing from him. She gently kissed across his stomach to the other side, brushed her fingers down the scar above his hip that was paler now, finally healing. She dipped her head and kissed it, willing it to no longer bother him, aware that it was a source of pain and conflict for him, that it had something to do with their enemy. One had hurt him, and damn, she wanted to make them pay for that. A fierce need to protect him as he protected her rushing through her, setting fire to her temper. He tipped his head back and moaned, shuddered as she licked the scar and traveled lower, towards his navel. She kissed around it and followed the fine trail of dark hair downwards to the waist of his black jeans. For a moment she feared he would stop her, would treat her as if she was too delicate for this, still weakened by what had happened to her when she was strong now, wanted this moment with him with all of her heart. He remained immobile, hands trapped in his t-shirt, breath stilled in his lungs, waiting. She undid his fly, carefully slipped her hands around his hips, under his trunks and jeans, and eased them down, her eyes glued to him, drinking her fill as she revealed him and not wanting to miss a thing. She moved to kneel before him as she pushed his jeans down his legs, as he stepped from them and finally discarded his t-shirt. And when he was naked, her eyes lifted, taking in every honed inch of him, some deep part of her purring in approval at the sight of him. He moaned again when she leaned towards him, his breath hitching as his bright blue eyes followed her. He tensed, his entire body going rigid as she stroked her tongue over the head of his shaft, and his low groan went through her, had her stroking him again, hungry to hear that sound she had pulled from him again, wanting the thrill that had come with it. She circled his cock with her right hand and wrapped her lips around the blunt crown, drank every groan that left his lips, each moan that stirred the heat inside her and had her growing restless. When she moved her hand on him, his shot down to grip her wrist, and she looked up at him. His eyes were dark as he shook his head, his pupils gobbling up the blue, revealing the depth of his desire to her. He was still a moment, and then he pulled her up to him and kissed her hard, pressing his rigid length against her belly as he gathered her into his arms. She clutched his shoulders, swept up in the kiss, losing herself in it as she clung to him, her passion slipping beyond her control. She needed him. Now. The urge was desperate, hit her so hard that she couldn't hold it back, clawed at his shoulders and kissed him harder, matching his fervor and groaning when it didn't satisfy the need rolling through her, one that only grew more frantic as he dropped his hand and cupped her through her jeans. She rocked into his touch, moaning into his mouth, swept up in the moment and needing more, wanting more.
Esher,
she whispered, shocked by the sound of her own voice, so raspy and needy. He growled and tackled her jeans, his movements jerky and rough, as if her desperation had flowed into him and was affecting him now, had him on the verge of losing control, frantic with a need to take things further, faster. She could barely breathe as he pulled her dark pink camisole off, tossing it aside, and swooped on her breasts. He tugged her left nipple into his mouth, and she gripped his shoulders again. His head couldn't decide where to hold him as she rose on her toes and melted under the onslaught, her entire body singing and coming alive, giving her everything she needed. He pushed her jeans down, growled again as he struggled to get them off her feet. She kicked at them, heart thundering, that desperate need mounting again as cool air washed over her body, each brush of it a blast of sensation that made her finally feel alive again. It overloaded her, had her crying out as Esher stroked his hands over her sides, her breasts, and lower, delving one between her thighs. She tiptoed, threw her head back, and moaned, holding nothing back as bliss swept through her, each caress of his fingers between her folds and his tongue over her breasts, sending her out of her mind. This was what she had been craving, needing. This bliss, this heaven. Nothing else existed here. There was only her and her beautiful Esher, lost in each other, in their love. He dropped to his knees, and she cried out as he pressed his mouth between her thighs. The first stroke of his tongue had her tensing, and the second had her grabbing his head, the onslaught of feeling almost too much to bear. She rocked against his face, shame forgotten as she spiraled higher, flew on wings he had made for her, each stroke of his tongue over her flesh sending 1,000 volts rushing through her, cranking that feeling in her belly even tighter.
Esher,
she moaned, bit her lip and frowned as she desperately rode his tongue, the hard press of his fingers against her thighs sheer ecstasy. He lifted her left knee, spreading her thighs, and she cried out again, not caring if anyone heard her as he licked her, flicking his tongue over her pert bead, sending electricity arcing along her every nerve. Her entire body jerked as release slammed into her, crashed through her and had her breath lodging in her throat as she quivered, tingles and heat sweeping through her, the suddenness of her release stealing her voice as her mouth opened on a silent cry. Esher lapped at her and moaned as he slowed his assault. Her legs trembled, her heart starting to race again as the haze of her climax began to fade and a new one built inside her, each gentle stroke of his tongue teasing her back towards the precipice. She needed more from him this time. He seemed to sense it, rose to his feet and kissed her, swept her into his arms and carried her the short distance to his bed. She kissed him as he lay her down on it, moaned as he covered her with his body, and sighed as he eased into her, so slowly that she could feel every hard inch of him. He pulled back, gazing down at her and stroking her hair and her face as he joined them, his blue eyes brighter than she had ever seen him, filled with love that touched her. She savored it just as he did, focused on their bodies fusing as one, the bliss of it even more powerful than it had been the first time they had made love. His black hair hung forwards, brushing her forehead as he looked down at her, body still inside hers. All that love shining in his eyes, but tainted with another emotion. Fear. Aiko framed his face with her palms, holding his gaze, trying to show him that he didn't need to be afraid. She was stronger now, wiser, and she wouldn't let his enemy hurt her again. And she believed in him, knew he would protect her and keep her safe. Nothing was going to happen to her.
I love you.
She brushed her thumbs across his cheeks. His eyes darkened. He swooped on her lips, kissed her so fiercely that she couldn't breathe as his pain flowed into her, swept through her and dredged up her own. She pushed back against it, refusing to let it overcome her and ruin this moment, and softened the kiss, coaxing Esher back from the brink, leading him. His kiss slowed until he was gentle again, each sweep of his lips across hers making her feel lighter inside, until she was floating in his arms. She moaned as he moved, reminding her that he was inside her, joined with her, and his answering groan came out strained. The fear that colored his emotions gradually drifted away with each long, slow thrust of his cock into her, each kiss she pressed to his lips. When he pulled back again, she locked gazes with him, fell into his blue eyes and into the moment, feeling him do the same. He stared down at her, his emotions playing across his eyes as he rocked into her, slow and measured curls of his hips that had the darkness inside her receding, the light growing brighter again. She held on to him as fiercely as he clung to her, his fingers pressing hard into her shoulder as he wrapped his arm around her, tucking it beneath her. He lowered his other hand to her side, clutching it as he drove into her, and she breathed in time with him, each one leaving her as a soft moan as pleasure built inside her. He groaned and lowered his head, pressed his brow to hers as he slid into her. I love you. He growled and gathered her closer, held her so tight it almost hurt, but all she felt was bliss as he clung to her, his love flowing through her, mingling with her own. She wrapped her arms around him, breathed against his lips.
I love you too, Esher.
He moaned, captured her mouth, and thrust harder, faster, tearing a sigh from her lips. The pressure built again, each plunge of his hips, each slide of his length into her, cranking her tighter. His chest brushed hers, teasing her nipples, and his tongue caressed hers, his kiss deepening as he held her closer, his hand sliding lower to capture her hip. She couldn't hold back the moan as he took her higher again, each brush of his body against hers sweet agony, each deep thrust of his cock sending waves of tingles over her belly. Light filled her, warmth flowed through her. Every breath, every movement was bliss, pleasure like she had never experienced before, filling her with light and life, with emotion that felt as if it would soon become too much for her and she would drown in it. She cried into his mouth as she broke apart, a cascade of hot tingles racing through her, sweeping up and down her as she jerked against him, every quiver and throb of her body around his cock sending a fresh wave rolling through her. Esher drove deeper, harder, faster, his breathing ragged as he pressed his forehead to hers and held her tighter. He grunted and jerked to a hard halt inside her, pressed deep in her as his cock throbbed wildly, kicking and pulsing, his warmth flooding her, making new delicious waves of bliss sweep through her with each one. She wrapped her arms around him as he sank against her, holding him close. He tilted his head, captured her lips, and kissed her softly. She kissed him back, forming a vow in her head and sealing the promise with each brush of her lips across his. She would never let him go. He would never be alone again. She would always be there for him. Forever. Chapter 26. Aiko tugged at the fluffy black jumper, the softness of the material comforting her as she fought to breathe normally. Beside her, Esher glanced down at her and squeezed her other hand, a silent reassurance that everything was going to be fine as they walked through Yoyogi Park. She smiled up at him, battling another bout of nerves as the sky grew darker, night rolling in. "You look pretty," he said, outwardly calm when she could feel he was nervous too. Didn't like exposing her like this and placing her in danger. Aiko looked down at herself, at the clothes he had bought for her today. The over-knee black socks, faded denim shirt, and fuzzy jumper were definitely more her style than the clothes she had borrowed from Megan, and when she had put them on, she had felt more like her old self. But she had the feeling that she wasn't. She felt stronger. Reading Esher and his brothers was easier than ever now. She only had to think about tapping into their thoughts to be able to read them. It was how she knew Esher believed his mother had done something to her soul, something he wanted to hide from her. It had been born of a desire to protect her when she had been feeling unsteady, overcoming what had happened to her, so she could forgive him for keeping it from her. But she could feel that she was different now. It was as if power flowed through her veins, filling her up, making her stronger than a normal human. Power she knew stemmed from Esher's world. In her dreams, she saw flickers of a dark world, and then green and golden light that felt warm, like life itself, chasing back the coldness. There was a gentle touch and soft words in a language she didn't know, but one she somehow understood. After that, the cold came sweeping in, and then she felt Esher's pain, his fury, and his darkness. But that darkness receded as a light slowly filled him, and then she woke in his room with him watching over her, fatigue and relief written in every line of his handsome face. They were memories, and they grew clearer each time the dream came. Aiko turned her head and studied his noble profile, tracing every line of it, memorizing it and the way he made her feel, safe, secure, warmed from head to toe, happy. He looked down at her, his steps slowed as their eyes met and he came to face her. She welcomed his kiss when he bent his head and pressed his lips to hers, melted into him when he wrapped his arms around her and held her, tucked her close to him so she could feel his heart pounding. It betrayed his nerves, spoke of them to her, and had her circling his neck with her arms, holding him in return to soothe him, to reassure him that she was fine and she wasn't afraid, because she knew he would keep his promise and he would protect her. If it helped him defeat his enemy and protect the world, she was happy to play bait for the demon. Their public walk would show the demon she was alive, and would make her believe she had a second chance to use her as a collar for Esher. The demon would make a move to secure her, and she would fall right into their trap. When he drew back, his hands falling to her waist, she smiled for him, showing him that she was going to be just fine. This was a hurdle they needed to overcome, something they had to do, so they could be together. And she wanted it over with now, so it no longer hung over their heads. She wanted the demon to pay for what she had done to her, and to Esher. He pressed his forehead to hers, rubbed noses with her, and then started walking again, leading her along the broad path that flowed beneath the tall trees, heading towards the shrine. He had wanted their walk to be somewhere more public, somewhere he would have the water in the city pipes on hand, but she had convinced him to choose the park instead, not wanting innocence to be caught in the firing line, reminding him that the park had lakes he could draw on with his power. She scanned the trees and the fields beyond them, just as she knew he was doing, waiting. His hand was tense in hers now, clutching it tightly, and she could feel his nerves, the anxiousness eating away at him. It aided her, too. She needed to speak to fill the dreadful silence and calm herself.
"Thank you for the clothes, and for getting my phone."
He glanced down at her, his eyes darkening as he raked them over her, the flare of desire in them pushing her fears to the back of her mind. "They suit you, but I didn't get your phone. You have to thank Diamond for that." She hadn't realized that he had been the one to retrieve it for her.
"I'll thank him later."
When this was over, Esher tensed up again, and she smoothed her thumb along his, trying to calm him and using the connection between them to soothe herself, too. "I should thank him, too." Esher looked down at her again out of the corner of his eye before he went back to scanning the park. "He tried calling you when they realized you were in danger." She had suspected the first attempt to reach her had been his brother, but now she knew for certain she would be thanking him for it.
"You tried to call, too. I was afraid the demon might be able to answer it, but the phone repelled her when she tried to take it from me."
He slowed again, grinding to a halt beside her, and she turned and looked back at him. His eyes were dark in the low light, but they glowed blue around his irises, giving away the feelings she could detect in him: the anger, the fury, the pain. "She'll pay for what she did to you, Aiko. I swear it," he growled. His powers surged, and she closed the gap between them and cupped his cheeks in her palms, hoping to help him control it as his face twisted, a scowl knitting his obsidian eyebrows as he stared down into her eyes, darkness shining in his, black needs that were easy to feel in him. Someone had hurt her, had taken her from him, and provoked the side of himself that he feared, the one the enemy wanted to harness.
Esher,
she whispered, keeping her voice low and soft, coaxing him back to her.
I'm fine now. Remember that. I'm safe. Don't let her get to you. Remember that I'm safe.
She lowered her right hand to his chest, flattening it over the spot above his heart. It beat hard against her palm, strong. The feel of it reassured her. He was powerful. He could handle the demon, she was sure of it. He would come back to her. His eyes dropped to her lips. She tiptoed and seized his, couldn't stop herself as a need rushed through her, commanded her to kiss him and not let him go, to stay by his side where he needed her even when she knew he needed her away from him more, needed to know she was safe and protected, and the demons couldn't reach her, couldn't hurt her again. He tensed, going rigid beneath her hands. A chill swept down her spine. Familiar contempt laced with darkness and a hunger that shook her blasted through her, directed right at her, and every instinct she possessed screamed she was in danger. She opened her mouth to scream at Esher to run, fear of him being hurt or worse forcing the word up her throat, making her desperate to tell him to forget fighting the demon, to plead him not to go through with it because she was terrified of what might happen to him. Before she could squeeze the word past her tight throat, masculine heat wrapped around her, his scent of earth evoking images of the green and the gold she had seen, the gentle voice and the soothing warmth, and darkness swallowed her. It evaporated, revealing the main living room of the mansion, and Ares and Valen as they shot to their feet, concern washing across both of their faces. Marek released her, and she turned on him.
Take me back. He needs me.
She fisted his charcoal linen shirt, and for a moment his rich brown eyes, flecked with gold and green, softened, and she felt sure he might listen. But then Karis appeared beside him, ribbons of shadows still clinging to him, fluttering around the arms of his black formal shirt and trousers, and over the soft spikes of his black hair. His green eyes hardened. "We can't do that. Esher needs to know you're safe." She knew that, but she still needed to go to him, even when she was sure she would only be a hindrance and not a help. Her presence would push at him, provoking his darker side, and his need to protect her would split his focus between her and his enemy, placing him in danger. Ares moved around the couch, a wall of muscle dressed in tight black clothing that matched Valen's, although his build was twice that of his purple-haired brother. His dark brown eyes lit with sparks of gold as he looked at her. "Listen to Karis, Aiko. Esher needs to know you're here, and you're protected." She forced herself to nod and drew down a deep breath, holding it to calm herself so she kept her head. Losing it wouldn't help Esher. They were right about that. He needed to know that she was at the mansion, safe within the wards, with his brothers watching over her.
How about we make some tea?
Megan said, as she left Ava's side, her pretty face and brown eyes warmed by her sympathetic smile, and her rich orange t-shirt and blue jeans a contrast to Aries' black clothing as she passed him. His eyes tracked her, a flare of fire heating them as he watched her walking towards Aiko. Esher looked at her like that, as if she was his whole world, and that was the reason she was going to remain where she was, where he needed her to be. Because she didn't want to see pain in his beautiful blue eyes again. She wanted them to always be warm and bright, filled with sunshine. She glanced at the rain-swept courtyard and the garden beyond it as she turned with Megan, and damn, she needed to be out there, needed to run to Esher and help him. The thought that he was fighting now, in danger, pulled at her, had her aching to go to him even when she knew that she wasn't strong enough to do such a thing. That his brothers were right and it was best she remained here, waiting with them. She wanted to tell them to go to him, to help him, because she couldn't. They could, though. They were powerful, strong. They could help him. Kara stepped into her path and took hold of her shoulders, darkness reigning in his eyes, turning them almost black, leaving only a sliver of green around his pupils. His voice was a low growl, one that said he knew her thoughts, offered comfort and reassurance, and buoyed her heart. "I swear to you, I will not let anything happen to Esher." She nodded and managed to smile to thank him, even as her heart began to grow heavy again, her thoughts weighing it down, fear that she would never see Esher again. Chapter 27. Esher wanted to growl the moment Marek appeared and snatched Aiko from his grasp. He wanted to step and follow her home, to attack his brother for daring to lay a hand on her even when it had been the plan all along. Instead, he breathed through the twin needs and focused on the park ahead of him as he strode out of the cover of the trees and onto the dark swath of grass, into the open. He raised his gaze to the moon, using its beauty to calm himself. It was barely a sliver now, would be a new moon soon. A good time to do battle. A new moon affected the tides as strongly as a full moon, and in turn affected him, drawing his power to the surface, making it well up inside him. He reached out with his senses, aware that somewhere in the park the demon lurked, watching him, waiting for her moment to attack him now that Aiko was gone, her trump card stolen from her. Darkness welled in time with his power, coaxed him into hunting the bitch down and butchering her for what she had done to Aiko. The female would pay. He would see to that. After she had talked. He would break her, would squeeze every drop of information from her, and then he was going to kill her. He was going to kill her. Karis wouldn't care once she had served her purpose, was no longer useful to them. His brother would let him do as he pleased with her, despised demons as much as the rest of them. Gods, he would probably want to lend a hand. But this kill belonged to Esher. He wouldn't share it with anyone. Not even Diamond and Callistos where they waited in the wings, his white-haired brother hiding in a tree close to the Tory gate across the field to Esher's right, and their blonde tornado casually reclining against a lamppost to his left, near the entrance of the park, doing the complete opposite of what he was meant to be doing. He glared at his brother even though Cal wouldn't see it, and twitched his left hand. Cal tipped his head back as the weather changed, more heavy mist than rain at first, but becoming a steady downpour as Esher focused on his power and the environment, allowing his anger and the burning need for violence to slip its leash enough to affect it. His youngest brother kicked away from the lamppost and disappeared as the wind picked up, gusting hard across the field and battering Esher. It whipped through the trees, shaking the branches, filling the still night air with ominous creaks and the steady swish of leaves brushing each other. Diamond moved. Esher sensed it as he dropped from his perch and teleported, shifting into position. Any moment now. The swirling sensation in his gut grew stronger, warning that it was almost time, and the coppery scent of demon hit him as the wind battered him. It blasted through the trees opposite him, so fierce that branches flew into the field, together with something else. The demon. Esher grinned and spread his feet shoulder-width apart, readying himself as he called on his power, and darkness spread through his veins, whispering delicious words about revenge. He launched his hand forwards, drawing on the lake of the tea house, and a wall of water swept behind her, cutting off her escape. It turned to ice as Diamond joined him, becoming a glittering white barrier 3 stories high that curved into a semicircle thanks to Cal's wind. Now he just had to form the other side of her cage. He caught a glimpse of a female with long inky violet hair and silver eyes that glowed as brightly as the moon, a black dress hugging her figure, and then she was gone, together with the park. He turned left and right, his pulse rocketing as a different scene constructed itself around him. Bright sunshine and endless green rolling hills replacing the darkness and the trees. A worn mud road snaked through the hills, leading his eye towards a distant village of stone buildings. His stomach sank, fear curling through his veins and his throat closing as he stared at that familiar village. His heart labored, kicking hard against his chest, and his mind screamed at him to run, to flee. Now. They were coming. Chance filled the air, had him spinning on his heel, desperately scouring the landscape for their source. When he turned back towards the village, a sea of humans blocked his path, barely a meter from him. torches and farm tools clutched in their hands, their dirty faces filled with fury as they shouted at him, jeered and waved their weapons. Someone screamed. His head snapped to his right, desperation flooding him as he tried to stop them from grabbing his companion. He lunged for the ones who held him, fear of what was going to happen spreading like poison through his veins, weakening him. When he was already weak, without his power, stripped of it, left vulnerable, he stilled, eyes widening in horror as the humans seized him, and he saw his companion being dragged kicking and screaming towards the village. Aiko. Her fear rushed through him, roused the darker part of himself, and he snarled as he pushed at the people trying to contain him, lashed out and struck one of them hard enough to send them down. The male remained on the ground, blood pouring from his face. Blood. Esher gritted his teeth, mustered all of his strength, focused on the bastards who were hurting Aiko as they pulled her by her arms, some of them moving to grab her legs. She kicked at them, hit one, but it wasn't enough to stop them. He was. He would stop them. He growled and focused harder, willed their blood to do his bidding. But it refused. They remained unaffected as they carried her, hollering vile things about her, calling her a witch. Burn the witch. Cold swept through him, followed by fire that blazed so hot he couldn't contain it. He snarled and managed to get his arm free, punched someone as they tried to hold him back, and kicked at another, desperation driving him. He needed to reach Aiko. He needed to save her. He couldn't fail her again. Something slammed into him, and he frowned as the world around him wobbled, the scenery rippling like a flag in the wind, and he saw a flicker of a different place, a darker place. The invisible force struck him again, knocking him right out of the world he had been in, landing him in a park. No! He pushed against the weight on him, growling through his fangs as he tried to get it off him. Aiko needs me! He had to get back to her. It's a fucking lie! Cal seized his shoulders and rattled him, slamming him into the grass, breaking the scenery that had started to build around him again. Esher stared up at his brother. Cal breathed hard, sweat beading on his brow, running down his jaw. No, it wasn't sweat rolling down his chin. It was tears. The shapeshifter could cast illusions just as they had feared, and she had shown Cal something terrible. Cal? He grabbed his brother's arms. Are you all right? Cal stared blankly at him. Of course I am. Why wouldn't I be? What did she show you? He feared asking that, but he needed to know. Nothing. Cal pushed off him, frowned, and stared at the grass. Something. I was over there where I was meant to be. And then I was... Where? His brother's blue eyes turned stormy gray. I don't remember. Cal shoved away from him, gripped the sides of his head in trembling hands, burrowing his fingers into his blonde hair and tugging strands loose from his ponytail, and gritted his teeth. I don't fucking remember. He never did. Thank the gods for that. For a moment, Esher had feared he would be able to remember the illusion he had seen. A messed-up version of his past if Esher's had been anything to go by. And it was better Cal didn't remember the details of what had happened back then. Esher wished he couldn't remember the things that had happened to him. Shitting fuckity fuck! Diamond was sounding particularly eloquent as he sprinted over to them. I saw you both go down. What the fuck happened? I don't know. Cal stared at him, eyes wide, irises swirling like a tempest. Diamond looked as if he wanted to embrace him, to hold him until the storm passed and he was calm again, and then shifted his ice-blue eyes to Esher. I saw my past, but Aiko was there. They took her. Gods, Esher didn't even want to think about what he had seen. It was too much. It roused the darkness in him, had brought him dangerously close to giving in to it. If he had seen the rest of the illusion, he would have surrendered to it. We need to find a way to combat. Diamond trailed off as the ground heaved and split open, and a huge black Grecian temple rose from it, earth and grass tumbling down the pitched roof as it pushed up. He leaned sideways towards Esher, but didn't take his eyes off the familiar building. You see that? Esher nodded. They're home. Cal stopped muttering to himself and stared at it, his mouth hanging open. I don't like this. Hades stepped out from between the towering fluted columns of the temple, dressed in his black armor, his eyes bright crimson and his bident gripped in his left hand. Persephone moved out from behind him, her red hair tumbling down around her pale shoulders. Wrong. Cal said exactly what he was thinking. Rather than the black dress of mourning that their mother had been wearing since losing Calindria, she wore a bright green dress, the sheer layers cinched with gold at her waist. I'm getting sick of these. Diamond curled his gloved right hand into a fist and lifted it, and spears of ice shot up from the ground, impaling Persephone. Her blood rolled down the white ice, stark against it. Hades leaped out of the path of them all, dodging them with ease, closing in on Esher and his brothers. Esher swept his hand across from right to left, hurling a wall of water that Hades ran straight into, one that transformed into clear ice a split second later, trapping the male. You think one of them was her? Diamond cautiously peered at the trapped Hades and the dead Persephone. It was possible the demon participated in her illusions, used them to mount an attack after weakening her enemies with their worst fears. Iko mentioned she wasn't strong. It stands to reason that she would employ whatever tricks she had at her disposal to win a fight. Esher slowly slid his gaze towards his right and then his left as two more temples rose from the grass, and two more sets of his parents strode out of them, followed by another two and then another two, until there were 10 Hades staring him down, with 10 Persephones beside him. Any guess which one might be her? Cal turned his back to Esher as the illusions spread out, forming a ring around them. Esher assessed them all, searching for any differences, and shook his head when he found none. We just have to kill them all. It feels wrong killing our parents, said the male who had driven an ice spear through their mother's heart without hesitation. Esher was going to pick Diamond up on that later. Esher had hesitated, the false Persephone so lifelike that his heart had almost been fooled into believing it was her. Diamond had stuck a spear through her. Although he supposed the presence of Hades was a dead giveaway that these weren't their real parents. Hades was trapped in the underworld, bound there and unable to leave. Cal and Diamond broke away from him, each attacking a section of the group surrounding him. Diamond threw small spears of ice, each one only a meter long, and Cal directed them with his wind, making sure none of the illusions could evade them. They buried 3 in each one, working together as they had practiced 1,000 times in the underworld, easily taking down their foes. Esher scanned the group again as more illusions appeared to join the others, replacing the fallen, keeping his brothers busy. There had to be a tell, a way of pinpointing which of the illusions was the shapeshifter. Esher! He turned as Iko's voice rose above the din of the battle and frowned as he spotted her running towards him across the park, her eyes round and filled with fear. Behind her, a female with a mass of blonde waves tied at the back of her head and a bikini made of golden swirls pursued her. Wings burst from her back as she kicked off, feathered on the top half and leathery below that, and she shot towards Iko, closing in on her. A Valkyrie. He reached for Iko, the desperate need to save her rising inside him again as she threw a terrified glance over her shoulder and ran harder. Damn it, Cal! Diamond's deep voice shattered the silence, and wind swept across the field, striking the Valkyrie and sending her hurtling through the air, tumbling and struggling to right herself. Diamond's gloved hand closed over Esher's wrist, ice burning his flesh through his long black coat, and pulled him back. It's not her. It is. Those 2 words burst from his lips, filled with certainty even as his heart wavered, was no longer sure whether it was really Iko before him. He couldn't risk standing by and doing nothing. If it was really her and she was hurt again, he would never be able to live with himself. Bright light off to his right had him squinting and looking down. Diamond tapped the send button on his phone. It was hardly the time to message someone. The phone vibrated almost instantly, and his brother turned the screen towards him, revealing a picture of Iko holding a clock that showed today's date and a time that almost matched Diamond's phone. It isn't her. His brother pocketed his phone, darkness washing across his face as he glared at the Iko running towards them. She wouldn't be here. She knows better. Remember that. Esher tried to drum it into his head, but it was hard when Diamond launched himself at Iko. His little butterfly. She shrieked and brought her arms up to cover her face, cried out and stumbled backwards as Diamond attacked her, pulling none of his punches. Rage curled through Esher's veins, a need to attack his brother building inside him, even as he focused on the image Diamond had shown him. Aiko wasn't here. The bitch was just trying to weaken him and find a way to attack him without him putting up a fight. Aiko was that weakness. The Valkyrie loosed a fierce shriek as she finally righted herself and swooped towards Cal. Cal blasted air at her, forcing her to sway side to side to dodge each attack. She kept plummeting towards him, her talons at the ready as she grinned, her golden eyes glowing in the darkness. Esher lined up his attack and let it loose, sending a spiral of water at her so fast that she didn't have a chance to see it coming. It struck hard, pummeling her right side and slamming into her wing, bending it at an awkward angle and ripping a cry from her throat as she veered off course. Cal grinned and stepped, landing on her back and shoving his boot into the back of her head, sending her hurtling towards the ground as he leaped off her and dropped at least 20 meters to land in a crouch on the grass. The Valkyrie hit it hard, tumbled and twisted, and found her feet, skidding backwards with her right hand clawing the earth to slow her to a stop. The second she stopped, she kicked off. Esher snarled and stepped, appeared and slammed into her side, knocking her back down. He seized her throat and growled as she lashed out at him with her talons, raking them over his black coat and leaving long tears in his sleeves. Her foot caught him in his gut, and he grunted as the air pushed from his lungs, and tightened his grip on her, cutting off her air supply. Fucking Karis would want to question her, too. Aiko screamed. Esher's head snapped towards her. The damned Valkyrie pressed her feet into his chest and kicked hard, knocking him onto his arse and freeing herself. She was gone before he had flipped onto his feet, her wings beating the air hard as she made a break for it. Cal casually stepped past Esher, and a smile curled his lips as she started to slow, and then hung in the air, her blonde hair streaming behind her in tangled waves as she battled the wind, making no progress. "You got her?" Esher moved the moment Cal nodded and started towards the Valkyrie. He broke left, running towards Diamond where he fought Aiko, telling himself on repeat that it wasn't really her. The park shattered again. "No!" He slammed to a halt, his pulse kicking up a notch as the village rapidly constructed itself around him. He didn't have time for this. Diamond and Cal needed him. A distant scream reached his ears. Cal. His heart thumped against his chest and he turned, tried to see the park through the illusion as it continued to build. She was fucking with his little brother again, and she was going to pay for it. He pushed off in the direction the scream had come from. Or would have, but he couldn't move. Esher looked down and swallowed hard at the sight of his wrists, bound in front of him, the rope wound around them up to his elbows. No. He shook his head, squeezed his eyes shut, and ground his teeth, fighting the pain that surged inside him and the fear as it pressed down on him, both of them threatening to crush him. It wasn't real. Another scream, only this time it was feminine. Aiko. His eyes shot open, head whipping up and heart stopping as he saw her. She struggled against her bonds, wriggling her shoulders as she grimaced, tears streaking her cheeks. Her brown eyes were wide, wild as she watched the males around her as they stacked wood against the platform on which she stood. She fought harder, kicked at the thick pole against her back, and frantically shook her head. "I'm not a witch!" Her bloodshot eyes tracked a male with a torch. "Please, I'm not a witch!" It wasn't real. Esher clenched his fingers into fists and stared down at them, focused on them and his breathing, trying to shut out her cries for help and the fear that flooded him. Her fear. Darkness welled, pushed up from his heart, whispered things that were honey in his ears, had him stilling as they swept through him, chasing out the fear and the pain. Kill them all. The humans didn't deserve his protection. They deserved death. He grunted as a stone struck his temple and leaned to his left, his skull aching from the fierce blow as warmth trickled down his cheek. Another followed it, cracking off his neck, and then another bit into his brow, between his eyes, and blood flowed down his nose. The dark voice grew louder. Kill them all. The humans deserved to burn. They deserved his retribution, not his protection. They were vile, wretched, unworthy. He bowed his head as stones pummeled him, each one a shard that pierced his heart, made it bleed. He was weak, stripped of his power, unable to fend them off. Why? Because his father wanted to protect them. His father had sent him, his son, to the world of humans without his powers, vulnerable to their wrath. His father had banished him too, had forced him to come to this world, to protect them. They didn't deserve his protection. They deserved to die. They feared him, so they beat him, tortured him, and tried to kill him. He would give them a reason to fear him. He growled and pulled his arms apart, easily snapping the ropes that held him, and devoured the startled gasps and fearful murmurs of the humans as they backed away from him. He pushed onto his feet, swayed a little as he gathered himself and got his bearings.
Esher!
Aiko screamed. His little butterfly. He would butcher them all for hurting her. His eyes snapped open and he grinned, baring fangs at the pathetic mortals quaking before him, and water swirled around his feet, gathering speed as the darkness poured through his veins. He would make this world burn, and the underworld would follow it. Chapter 28. Aiko wouldn't want this. It was there in the back of his mind, an irritating buzz that refused to be silent as he cut through the humans, slashing throats with his claws and hurling spears of water that hit them so fast they punched holes straight through their chests or their skulls. Esher didn't care. The humans were getting what they deserved, and it was glorious. Beautiful. Gods, it was beautiful. He groaned, pleasure rolling through him as he caught a male by his throat and focused on him. Only a split second of his attention, but enough to have blood pouring from his eyes and nose. He tossed the dead mortal aside and sought his next target, his scarlet eyes scanning the carnage. A female ran, wailing as she tried to escape. He stepped, landing in front of her, so she slammed into him. A growl curled up his throat. "You dare touch me?" He lifted his hand, and her scream cut short as water blasted upwards from the ground, impaling her, spraying as blood from her skull. "Impudent wretch!" He spat on her corpse and turned in a slow circle, hungry for another kill, his chest heaving as he breathed hard. When he saw only the dead, he stopped, ran his hands through the blood coating the earth, and smeared it down the side of his face. A-hunting he would go. He grinned. The path before him wavered, and he frowned. He turned his head, and his scowl deepened as the village became transparent at the edges of his vision, allowing him to see something else beyond it. Another plane. One that his brother stepped through from, his wet white hair plastered to his brow, and his blue eyes showing a flicker of fatigue and wariness. Fear. Esher. Diamond slowly raised his hands. "Listen to my voice, Esher." No, he didn't want to calm down. He was hunting. "It isn't real, Esher." Diamond edged towards him, and Esher's eyebrows dipped lower, a sensation that he might be telling the truth going through him when Cal stepped through the wall of a building beyond him, dragging a shrieking Valkyrie by her broken wing behind him. "Anyone know what her charm is?" Cal's words slowed as he looked around and arched a blonde eyebrow. "What's with the change of scenery? I think the demon is weakening, allowing us to move between the illusions." Diamond didn't take his eyes off Esher. "You need to calm down now, because you're dangerously close to doing what she wants." He blinked and looked between his brothers. What who wanted? He was doing what he wanted. He wanted to kill all the humans. It was time they all paid for what they had done to him. "Aiko needs you to pull your shit together, Esher. Don't do this to her. She needs you to be strong and not let the darkness pull you under." Diamond held his hands up, revealing a device that held an image in his right one. A female. He stared at her. Aiko, his little butterfly. "They're going to burn her." Cold fear gripped him, and he pivoted on his heel, his voice dying as he stared across the village. Aiko was gone. So was the platform where she had been bound. "It isn't real." Diamond moved another step closer to him, grunted and stilled, and looked down. The scent of blood swirled around Esher. Familiar blood. Diamond touched his side, pulled his hand away, and stared at it. Crimson coated his glove. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, and then threw his head back and roared as he swept his arms up into the air. 1,000 shards of clear ice shot up around them, forming a wall 30 meters tall. Esher continued to stare at the blood. The darkness that had been fading swept back in, stronger than before, pushing at his fragile control. Diamond was hurt. His brother was in pain. Wounded. Not by humans, but by a filthy fucking demon. He snarled and scanned the village, but only his brothers stood with him within the wall of ice that cut through several of the buildings. It wasn't real. The illusion wavered in places, thinning around the edges of his vision as he scanned it again, but solid wherever his eyes landed. Diamond was right, and the shapeshifter was weakening, her strength drained by using her power to create the illusions. But she also had the upper hand, had managed to stab Diamond before any of them had sensed her. Wind whipped past him, pushing him sideways toward his brothers as it built, forming a wall within the barrier of ice, one designed to keep the demon contained and where Esher wanted her. They were back on track with their plan at least. He glanced at Diamond, at the wound he clutched as he growled obscenities. When Diamond noticed him looking, his brother turned towards him and clapped a hand down on his shoulder, the touch brief but enough to reassure him, and leave a glittering patch of frost on the black material of his coat. Valkyrie came around, shrieking like a banshee. She didn't have a chance to move. Cal was on her in a heartbeat, hands against her shoulders, pinning her to the ground. What was her charm again? He looked up at Diamond and then Esher. Vambraces. Esher nodded towards the cuffs protecting her forearms. She screamed and frantically wriggled, her gold eyes flashing fire as Cal shifted his weight, using his knees to trap her shoulders as he caught hold of her arms. He tore one vambrace off her and then the other, and she sagged, fear flooding her eyes as she stared up at him. I really want to kill you. Cal sounded as happy about Karis's capture and question plan as Esher felt. His brother leaned over her and ran a hand down his face, over 3 red streaks that cut over his jaw and down his neck. I'll make you pay for this later. Her eyes widened. For now, it's night-night time. Cal smashed his fist into her face and she slumped, body going lax beneath him. His brother was a cheat when it came to fighting with his fists, used his control over the air to propel his punches so he hit with the force of a tornado. Cal pushed off her, and the moment he was clear of her, Esher directed some of the rain at her, focusing it there. Diamond used it, crafting a box of clear ice at least a meter thick on all sides, leaving the Valkyrie stretched out on a floor made of it. Esher drilled a single hole in it, because Karis would be annoyed if she died from asphyxiation. Satisfied that she wasn't going anywhere, he turned his focus back on his surroundings. The village illusion held, but it was still thinner at the edges of his vision as he glanced around, revealing the park. His senses sparked. He turned on a pinhead and lashed out with a whip made of water, cracking it hard in the direction of the movement. It hit nothing in the illusion, but something screamed, something female. The coppery and vile scent of demon blood flooded his nostrils. The village wavered and some of the buildings crumbled, the ground transforming into the grass of the park. His gaze zipped to the far side of their icy arena as something moved there, and he kicked off, darkness swallowing him for a heartbeat as he stepped, teleporting into her path. He froze as he landed, and Aiko stood before him, her fluffy jumper soaked from the rain, and her short faded denim skirt saturated and sticking to her legs. She pushed her wet hair out of her face and gazed up at him. You're all right. I was so worried. She reached for him. He watched her hand edging towards him, told himself to move, to smack it away and step, but he couldn't convince his body to obey him. Her brown eyes warmed, showing her love, heating him through. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but it wasn't her. It wasn't Aiko. It was just another illusion, one meant to weaken him and lure him away from her. Aiko was at the mansion, not here in the park. She was safe. He shot his hand out, and it went straight through her. Her laughter rang through the park, gaining a strange echo, and then another, and he slowly looked around him, his eyes widening as 100 Aikos looked at him, laughed at him. One of them was the shapeshifter. He scanned as many as he could, seeking the source of the blood he could scent in the air, sure he would find the wound on the Aiko that was the demon in disguise. 3 of the Aikos threw themselves at him, and he grunted as they hit him, knocking him backwards. Which is the demon? Cal hollered as he fought 6 of them off, scattering them with a blast of wind, sending them toppling into the others. I have no idea. Diamond stepped and appeared beside Esher, ripped one of the clones off him and pushed her aside. Esher closed his eyes and shoved the other 2, unable to bring himself to fight them when he was looking at them, seeing Aiko before him. Make it rain harder. Diamond closed ranks with them and Cal joined them, fending off the false Aikos as they tried to reach him and Diamond. Esher nodded. That he could do. It took only a brief thought and it was lashing down, the rain a thick wall around them, soaking him and his brothers to the bone. Diamond's eyes brightened, began to glow white in the darkness. Frost swept over his gloves and up his arms, spreading and forming ice flowers as it branched outwards and thickened. Esher gritted his teeth as he felt the pull of his power as Diamond focused his own on it, ripping command of the raindrops from him one by one. You might want to shield us. Diamond bit the words out, breathing hard between each one as his eyes blazed white. Not good. Esher pushed his focus to the rain, fighting to control it at the same time as Diamond forced his will upon it, and Cal grunted beside them, wavering on his feet as his own power came under their brother's influence. Esher had barely managed to convince the rain to avoid hitting them, forming a dome over them that spread 3 meters in all directions when it hit. A polar vortex. The temperature dropped so suddenly it stole Esher's breath, had his teeth chattering as frost formed on his clothes and sent Cal to his knees as he shook, gripping himself and desperately rubbing his arms. Esher struggled for air as it thinned, the effect of the vortex created by combining Cal's wind and Diamond's ice, as he chilled the rain Esher had provided, making the atmosphere within the boundaries of the vortex thinner than beyond the towering thick ice walls surrounding them. The temperature plummeted further as Diamond growled, shards of ice forming on his shoulders and rising from his hair like a crown, his outstretched hand trembling as he struggled to control the vortex he had created. Snow blanketed the ground, creeping towards them. Diamond, dial it back, Cal snapped, sounding weak now. Esher shoved Diamond hard, shattering his focus, and the wind eased, the snow halting and the air grew thicker, easier to breathe. It remained freezing within the sphere of the ice walls, though, the temperature well below 0, closing in on -50 Celsius. As the storm cleared and the temperature slowly rose, Esher's eyes gradually widened. Diamond's plan had worked. The illusion was gone, and in the center of the icy arena, on a thick blanket of snow, the demon sat clutching her knees, her breath fogging the air. Esher had half a mind to kill her. Would be easy given the freezing temperatures, too. Any water he called now would become ice in an instant, and gods, he wanted to drive a spear of it right through her black heart. But he had promised his brothers he would capture her. So he trudged towards her through the knee-deep snow, savored the way she lifted her head, revealing ashen skin that was almost blue and suited her black lipstick, and how she whimpered when he closed his hand around her throat and hauled her onto her feet. How fear lit her eyes as he squeezed his fingers tighter. Kill her. It was tempting, beyond tempting, and he struggled against the urge as he stared at her, at the bitch who had killed his beloved Aiko, who had hurt his brother and threatened his world. Esher. Diamond's voice cut into his dark thoughts. We need to mark her with the counter wards and take her to the others. He was going to kill her. Later. Once she had spilled her guts to his brothers. Chapter 29. Karis took hold of the demon's arm as soon as Esher appeared in the mansion courtyard with her. When his brother tried to lead her away, Esher kept hold of her, stopping him. What are you going to do with her? Because he needed to know where she would be held during her interrogation, and because he wanted to know where he had to go when his brother was done with her, and he could kill her and erase her filth from his home. You don't want to know. Karis glanced towards one of the buildings set to one side of the property beyond the bathhouse, one Esher kept locked at all times, one that contained his cage. Esher growled, the vision of metal bars closing in on him, tearing at him, tugging the darkness back to the surface and pulling a startled and fearful gasp from the demon beside him. She began struggling, trying to break free of him, and it was only when Karis touched his other arm that he realized he had closed it around her throat and had been choking the life out of her. Tears streaked her cheeks, her eyes wild and mercury irises swirling with panic, as he released her and she sucked down air. He shoved her away from him into Karis and ignored his brother's glare, not caring that he had forced the demon against him. "Just tell me when you're done with her," because he didn't want to see the damned cage, not until he had to see it, was left with no choice but to place himself inside it in order to protect this world. This world. He waited for his usual thoughts to fill his mind, images of himself lighting the fuse and watching it all burn, giving the mortals what they deserved. They didn't come. He scrubbed a hand down his face as he realized the reason behind that. He wanted to protect this world now. He almost wanted to protect the humans. Almost. The only human he wanted to protect came screaming out of the house at full speed and barreled into him, knocking the wind from his lungs as they collided, and then again as she caught him around the nape of his neck and dragged him down for a kiss that was so soft, so full of love and relief, that it stole his breath. He swept Aiko up into his arms. His Aiko. The real Aiko. His little butterfly. He held her as Karis and Ares escorted the demon away, and Diamond and Cal appeared, done with their cleanup duty in the park, leaving no evidence of the battle behind, including the dead Valkyrie. Diamond's cold snap had been too much for her, the air inside her icy cage dropping so low that she had been asphyxiated after all. They had vowed not to mention that to Karis and the others. Diamond nodded as he passed him, and wearily trudged after Karis and Ares. It would be a while before Diamond regained his strength after combining their powers. The first time Diamond had attempted such a trick, he had passed out and had slept for 3 days straight. Cal nudged Esher in the ribs, winked at him a few times, and went into the house. Esher scowled at his back, but his anger over his brother intruding on his moment with Aiko and insinuating they were going to be up to something soon, something wicked, melted away as Cal entered the house and his voice rose in the night, loud enough for the neighbors to hear as he regaled Valen and Marek, Megan and Ava with the tale of their battle, embellishing a few things as he went. Gods, it was good to be home. He tucked Aiko closer to him, absorbing the warmth of her in his arms. Literally.
"You're freezing,"
Aiko murmured against his chest and wriggled, and he reluctantly eased his grip on her. "Diamond." It was all the explanation he offered, but it drew a smile from her, one that had a hint of relief about it as she glanced at his brother's back and then up into his eyes again.
"I'm glad you're all safe."
Her eyes drifted back to Karis, though, as he walked down the corridor that led towards the bathhouse, and they darkened. Esher smoothed his hand across her cheek, luring her back to him, out of the mire of her thoughts that colored her eyes, and had him wanting to go after the demon, too, for her sake. He didn't like that look in her eyes, those dark desires he could see in them, born of her pain. They made him want to hold her, to tell her that he would never let her fight, would never let her near another demon, didn't want her to sully herself by getting blood on her hands. He was violent enough for both of them, would carry out the revenge she needed, retribution he wanted too. He led her to his room and changed his clothes, swapping his combat gear for a pair of blue jeans, a black t-shirt, and his favorite blue-gray shirt. He focused on buttoning it, forcing his mind away from the demon and the things he wanted to do to her, the pain he wanted to inflict on her, and the death he wanted to deliver. When he was cleaned up, he led Aiko to the main room of the mansion and made himself sit on the couch with her, holding her as he listened to the end of Cal's theatrical rendition of what had happened in the park, and watched Megan healing the wounds on his brother's face and neck. "Diamond has a wound that needs healing too," Esher said, and Megan nodded, and he did his best to focus on Aiko and those in the room with him. But all the while, his senses were locked on the building where his cage was stored, where Karis had the demon held captive and at his mercy, where he wanted to be. Aiko brushed her palm across his cheek, shattering the hold his urges had on him, and he leaned into her touch. He tilted his head and pressed a kiss to her palm, and held her closer to him, maneuvering her onto his lap. His eyes met hers, and he held them, let her see in his that nothing bad was going to happen to her. The demon was secure, trapped by the cage, and no demon could penetrate the wards around the mansion. She was safe. He would make sure of that. He pressed a kiss to her lips, and rose spread across her cheeks when she pulled back, her eyes leaping to their company. Cal grinned like an idiot, all "I told you so." He wiped it off his brother's face with nothing more than a glare, and a small dousing of rain, just enough to wet him through again where he stood near the coffee table. "Esher." Aries' deep voice rolled through the room, and everyone stilled. Iko tensed. Esher turned his head to his right, leaned back, and peered past Mark to his older brother. Aries' grim expression had a sense of foreboding trickling through Esher's blood, foreboding that turned into dark, inky tendrils that snaked around him as his brother spoke again. "You want to hurt the demon? Karis is giving you the chance." Iko was quick to get off his lap, clearing the way for him. He rose to his feet and looked down at her, at the darkness in her beautiful eyes, and lingered. "Stay here." He swept his knuckles across her cheek, holding her gaze, needing to see in it that she would do as he asked, because he didn't want her seeing what he was going to do. "I'll be right back." She didn't nod, so he looked down at Mark, who answered his silent plea with a tilt of his head, letting him know that he would make sure Iko didn't follow. Esher broke away from her, taking deep breaths to steady himself as he crossed the room to Aries, and followed him to the small white building where they were holding the demon. His heart pounded as he neared it. Memories of passing days at a time shut inside it, wild with a need for violence and bloodshed pressing down on him. Diamond stood sentinel outside the closed wooden doors. His brother's icy blue eyes warmed with concern as Esher approached. He nodded to let him know that he would be fine. Aries paused on the threshold as Diamond reached for the door. "Go and get Megan to deal with that wound I know you're trying to hide from me." Diamond huffed and scowled at Aries, and Esher gave Diamond a look that backed up what Aries had said, asking his younger brother to see Megan about his wound, because he needed to focus, and right now he was worried about Diamond, and it was making it hard to keep himself level. Diamond nodded and opened the door for him and Aries. The female shrieked and banged against the sides of the cage, not moving it even when she put all of her strength into each attack. She gripped the thick bars and growled as she pulled on them, her desperation lacing the air. Fresh black blood rolled down her cheek from a cut across it and splattered across her bare arms, and a rip cut from the hem of her black dress up to her hip, exposing her thigh as she fought to get free. "Is she not being cooperative?" Esher couldn't keep the hint of sarcasm out of his voice as he approached her, because his brother should have known better than to expect a demon to talk. Karis shifted green eyes edged with obsidian to him, and they narrowed as his black eyebrows dipped, the corners of his lips turning downwards as he stepped back from the cage. The wooden doors slammed behind Esher, sending a ripple of fear down his back that he breathed through. He wasn't going in the cage this time. The demon hissed at Karis, screamed as shadows lashed out at her in response, slicing her legs and her arms. As he watched, a sense of satisfaction rolling through him, Esher considered what they knew about her, searching for a way to make her speak, one other than hurting her, which was a first for him. Normally, violence was the only viable option, the only one he wanted to pursue. But he found himself hunkering down in front of the vile wretch, pulling all of her focus to him. She swiped at the shadows as they slithered away from her, breathing hard and fast, and then she stilled and her eyes slowly lifted to meet his. "I want to go home," she whispered, her silvery eyes growing wilder as she edged towards him, clawing at the stone floor. "I want to go home." Her demeanor changed, her face softening, and she held her bloodied hands out to him. "Let me go home, Esher. Take me back to the clinic. It's too frightening here." Her eyes darkened, a vicious sneer pulling at her black lips as she looked around her and then at him. "Your powers won't work when you're in the cage." It was what he despised most about it. At the height of his strength, when he needed to let it all flow out of him before he burst, he couldn't use a damned drop of his power. She hissed at him and launched at the bars, her hands clearing them to reach for him. She fell just short, her hands harmlessly clawing at the air inches from his face. "I want to go home. It's all I want," she snapped, her eyes glowing as she struggled to reach him.
If I can't have it, I'll make the world burn. You want the world to burn, don't you, my beautiful pet?
Esher spat at her. Pet? I'm not your fucking pet. She chuckled and eased back, her lips splitting in a wide grin.
But you will be. Mine. She promised.
Who promised? He was getting somewhere, further than Karis, judging by the way his brother huffed behind him. Her eyes grew wary, and she ran her fingers down her violet hair, clawing at it and pulling knots from it as she looked around her, eyes darting everywhere, her fear flooding the room with her vile demon stench. Who? He bit out, and she tensed, shrank back, and then exploded forwards, her arms flying between the bars of the cage to reach for him again.
My pet!
She swiped at him, desperation etched on her face as she struggled to reach him. Esher smacked her hands away, so hard her left arm hit the cage and bent backwards, and she shrieked. I'm not your pet. I never will be. Your friends aren't coming for you. He leaned towards her and sneered. Your only hope for survival now is to tell us everything we want to know, and then maybe I'll make you my pet. Her skin paled, the color leaching from it as she began tugging at her hair again, frantically looking at his brothers and then him, and then around her at the thick blank walls of the building. Would you like to be my pet? He canted his head to the left, and her eyes landed on him, her fingers pausing in her hair. She blinked, hesitated. Or maybe you want to die. He raised his hand. She flinched away, curling into a ball, clutching her head. When he didn't strike her with his power, she slowly uncurled and fixed him with terrified eyes.
She'll kill me anyway. Kill me for failing. You can't protect me.
I can. No demon can reach you here. Kara stepped forwards and she hissed at him, her eyes darting up to him as she backed away, towards the other side of the cage. You know what happened to the others who faced us? She swallowed hard, dipped her chin just a fraction of an inch, enough to reveal she knew what had happened to her comrades. Your wraith friend killed Trickster, Ares put in and moved to flank Esher, folding his thick arms across his broad chest, stretching his black t-shirt tight. His eyes glowed with crackling flames as he glared down at the demon. You think he won't kill you too if you get out of here, away from our protection? She clawed at the ground again, eyes flickering between him and his brothers, and he could see she was close to talking, was afraid the wraith would kill her just as he had dealt with Amori before they could get him to speak. It's why we brought you here, where you're safe, protected. Esher emphasized the last word because it seemed to hit her in just the right spot, had her fear fading a little whenever she heard it. I can protect you from the wraith. By killing her first. But she didn't need to know that.
He won't hurt me.
There was a certainty about her that had him feeling she was telling the truth, that she knew the wraith wouldn't hurt her.
She will.
Who is she? He edged closer, holding her focus as he felt his brothers tense.
She promised me a kingdom in exchange for taming you, my pet.
The demon reached through the bars to him, her eyebrows furrowing as she stroked her hands down the air, as if she was caressing him, petting him. He managed to stop himself from snapping and lashing out at her, and held his ground, letting her think he was fine with her wanting to touch him, calling him a fucking pet.
A world within our old home to call our own, and I could bring you all the humans you desired. You would like that, wouldn't you?
She husked. He leaned closer, mind filling with a vision of his fortress in the underworld, bathed in the blood of humans, the air filled with their cries. Karis's hand came down on his shoulder. We should take a break. He jerked back, baring his fangs at the bitch as he realized she had been luring him under her spell, and he had been close to answering her and claiming everything his heart desired, revenge upon the humans. No. He didn't want revenge now. It had been all he had craved once, but no longer. Aiko had opened his eyes, had made him see the good in mortals again, and now he wanted to protect both her world and his from the machinations of his enemy. He pushed onto his feet, schooling his features so she didn't see his anger at her for trying to play him, and his fury at himself for almost falling for it. Karis opened the doors and stepped out into the early morning light, and Ares followed. Esher lingered, looked back at the demon, and held her mercury gaze that promised him all the destruction, all the bloodshed his darker side had once desired. But now it wanted something else. He turned away from her, closed the doors and locked them, and followed his brothers into the main house. Aiko rose onto her feet as he entered, leaving the couch to cross the room to him. He sighed as she wrapped her arms around him, lowered his head and pressed his forehead to hers as he held her, using the feel of her nestled close to him where she belonged to soothe himself and ease the hold his other side still had on him. "Has she said anything?" Valen looked over the back of the couch at Karis. Karis sighed. "Nothing much. She confirmed we are dealing with another female, one she seems frightened of too, just as Benares and Jin were, and one who promised her a kingdom if they succeeded. I will hazard a guess this mysterious female desires father's throne, and gathered this group to assist her, offering them the one thing they wanted." Marek looked from Karis to Valen, and then Ares as he joined Megan, slumping onto the arm of the armchair where she sat. "Benares and Jin wanted to rule this world." Valen leaned back into the couch as Karis rounded it, and Esher settled back on the other couch with Aiko, wedging himself between her and Marek. "This one wants to rule a part of the underworld." Ares slid his arm around Megan's shoulders. "Like we would let that happen." "Any clue what the Wraith wants?" Cal leaned against the wall and shoved his hands in his pockets. "No." Karis was quick to say that, and everyone kept quiet, not mentioning his involvement in what had happened to Calindria. When Cal's eyes grew stormy, Esher snagged his attention. "My blade in his gut. I owe him," Esher said, tugging a grin from his youngest brother, and wary looks from the rest of his brothers. He wanted to say it had been a poor joke, but it wasn't. The hunger to hunt down the Wraith and kill him was still there, burning in his heart, blazing in his soul. Something pressed against his side, and he looked down, stared at Aiko's delicate hand where it covered the spot where his scar was beneath his blue-gray shirt. The scar burned. He knocked Aiko's hand away and gripped his side, a growl tearing from his lips as the wound blazed white-hot, stealing his breath. "Fuck!" He gritted his teeth. "What's wrong?" Marek was on him in a flash, clutching his shoulders as he struggled against the pain. He wasn't sure. "It hurts," he bit out. Went cold. The Wraith. It wasn't possible. Escher shot to his feet, head whipping towards the cage, and teleported just as internal alarm bells rang, warning him that something had broken through the wards. Not possible. Nothing was powerful enough to break the wards. No one knew the counter wards. He and his brothers, Diamond and Cal, had marked the shapeshifter with counter wards, but they were on her back where she couldn't see them, and with the cage stealing her powers, there was no way she could have told the other demons even if she did know them. He flung the wooden doors on the white building open and stared at the cage, at the wisps of violet smoke that hung in the air where the demon had been. "Fuck!" Ares growled as he appeared beside him and saw what he had. "How the fuck did he get through the wards?" "Counter wards," Marek offered as he raced from the main house, followed by the others. "Father created the wards. We're the only ones who know which ones he used." Cal had a point. Their father wouldn't have told anyone about them. Escher pressed a hand to his side as another cold wave rocked him. His voice was distant to his ears as he stared blankly at the empty cage. "What if the Wraith knew? What if, when his blade, it feeds him souls?" Karis sharply turned towards him. "Escher, this isn't your fault. If it's anyone's fault, it's mine." Valen moved in front of him, raked fingers through his violet hair, and blew out his breath. "It's my fault for bringing Ava here when she was hurt. You left because of it." Escher shook his head. The blame didn't lie with Valen. Ava had made him want to leave, that was true, because he hadn't wanted to hurt her, knowing it would hurt Valen too. But he had been the one to let the moon distract him. He had been the one to lower his guard and allow the Wraith to plunge the blade into him without him noticing. Gods. The thought that the bastard had managed to devour a fragment of his soul before Megan had been able to reverse the damage done to him and save him sickened him. Had darkness pouring through his veins and that hunger returning to consume him. The things the shapeshifter had known, the details of his past that only he knew, made sense now. The Wraith had told her everything, must have been able to show her somehow, revealing the memories locked in his soul so she could use it against him to weaken him, to bring him over to their side. "I'm a liability," he whispered, heart aching as he considered what he needed to do. He couldn't bring himself to look at his brothers, didn't think he could bear seeing their faces as they told him he was right, as they pushed him away to protect themselves. "The wards are useless now. They know everything I do, all of our tactics, and they know how to affect me. They know fucking everything. And that means I have to go." He had to go. He had to leave and get as far from his brothers as he could. He needed to protect them, and it was the only thing he could do. He would never let them come to harm, would leave to keep them safe, even if it killed him. The shapeshifter had been right, and the Wraith had chosen to take her rather than kill her, which meant she was important to him, and gods, maybe he could somehow use that against him. It also meant she was out there, recovering, and she would come for him again. He had to leave before that could happen. Karis clutched his shoulder and squeezed it hard, and Esher looked at him, braced himself for a world of pain, but found only love and understanding in his older brother's green eyes. "It means you have to get working on new wards." "I'll help." Ares lightly tapped him on the arm. "I'm good with wards. We can each pick one, keep it to ourselves." Cal's suggestion had everyone nodding. "Like I'd tell you my ward anyway." Valen grinned. "You'd be jealous of how amazing it was, and I'd never hear the end of it." Diamond smiled. "I've seen your wards." That earned him a scowl from Valen, and electricity arced across his fingers. "What's that meant to mean?" "It means your wards are shitty." Ares kept a straight face. "Father always said you were the worst at them. Lacked finesse. I think those were his exact words." Esher couldn't believe what he was hearing, stood mute as his brothers joked around him. No trace of the anger he deserved in them, no hint of distrust. Even Karis smiled as he looked at the horizon. "It's getting light. We should get to work." The rest of his brothers moved away, and Esher watched them go, stared after them as they broke apart and scattered, each choosing a different route around the garden, seeking something they could use to contain a new ward. "It was not your fault, Esher." Karis remained where he was, and Esher looked at him, wanting to say again that it was, but held his tongue when his brother approached him. "This war will not be easy. It will test us. But we knew that. I worry it will test you the most, though." Because he was a liability, and he had the feeling the enemy wasn't done with him. He had resisted them this time, but the demon had still been intent on making him belong to her. And now she was gone, returned to the mysterious female who was in charge, who had ordered her to turn him into her pet, into a weapon they could use to bring about the downfall of the gates and the future they wanted. They needed to know who that female was. "When the Wraith came," Karis started, "I felt him." Esher finished for him and lowered his hand to his side. "I knew he was close." Karis's slow smile said it all. The Wraith had stolen information from Esher, but in turn he had given Esher a way of tracking him. He watched his brothers go to join the others, the hunger to hunt rising inside him again, stronger now that he knew he would be able to track the Wraith once he was close enough, could use the wound he had inflicted to locate him. Sure, the pain would grow stronger the closer he was to the bastard. Aiko slipped her hand into his, drawing him back to her. He dipped his head and brushed his lips across hers, used the kiss and the way she responded, looping her arms around his neck and holding him tightly, to ground himself and push away from the urge to hunt. There was something else he needed to do more. He needed to make sure Aiko and his brothers were safe, and that their home was protected, ready for when the enemy made their next move, one he was sure would come sooner rather than later. They would be ready for them. It was agony, but he forced himself to break away from her lips and met her gaze. Would you like to learn how to make a ward?
I thought only powerful beings could create them.
Her eyes darted between his, and he had the feeling his brothers had been telling her all about their world in his absence, keeping her mind occupied while he had been fighting the demon. He nodded and turned away from her, leading her towards the cherry tree she loved so much. I think you'll be able to handle it. She stopped him dead with her words.
Because I'm like you now?
Esher looked back at her, and he must have looked as surprised as he felt, because she giggled, her brown eyes bright with her smile that warmed him, chased away the dark clouds in his heart, and allowed light to shine back in. He had meant to break it gently to her that he suspected his mother had done something to her soul, blessing it to make her immortal for him, tied to the underworld just as he was. But she knew.
You broadcasted your worries a little when we were in the park tonight.
She pulled him with her, and he realized that she also knew he meant for her to place a ward on the boulder beneath the cherry tree. Must have read that too.
It's easier to know what you're thinking now that I'm stronger.
Clearly it was. Worryingly easy. He would have to warn his brothers to be careful around her.
I won't go poking in their heads.
She smiled over her shoulder at him, and God's, it felt so normal, hit him hard as he walked behind her, letting her lead him. Only a few minutes ago, he had been convinced he was on the verge of losing everything he loved, was a danger to everyone and had to leave. Rather than pushing him away to protect themselves, they had gathered around him, had shown him the depth of their love and that they were going to protect him. He only hoped he could withstand whatever trials lay ahead of him and live up to their faith in him, deserving that love. His family. He listened to them as they talked, as Ava asked what Valen was doing and Megan teased Aries, telling him that he was messing it all up, and Karis chastised Cal for picking too simple a ward and told him to do it again. They were his family, all of them, Aiko included, and he would never give up, would never give in, would keep fighting the darkness in his heart in order to protect them and their homes. The underworld. And this one. The skyline beyond the white wall enclosing the garden flickered to the other world, and the newfound strength beating in his heart grew stronger as he saw it looked better now, some of the damage reversed by the blow he had dealt his enemy today, removing one of their ranks and making it clear he wouldn't succumb to his darker self. At least not easily.
Esher?
Aiko's soft voice lured him back to her, and he realized they had reached the cherry tree. He stared at her as she smiled at him, his beautiful immortal, his little butterfly. Her smile faded, her face falling as he drew her towards him, a flicker of heat igniting in her eyes as she looked up into his and allowed him to guide her into his arms, back where she belonged. "What am I thinking?" he murmured, lowering his head. Her blush answered him, but she breathlessly whispered,
"Later."
He dropped his lips to hers, brushed them tenderly, and shut the world out as he kissed her, giving her a taste of what was to come when his brothers were gone and they were alone. He held her close, and her heat seeped into him, her soft sighs stirring fire in his veins and strengthening the resolve in his heart. His little butterfly. A single question rang in his mind, echoing there as he savored her kiss and the feel of her in his arms. What would he do for her? For her, he would destroy his enemies and protect the humans he had once despised, ones he was learning to forgive because she had opened his eyes and his heart again. He would defend the gates and fulfill his duty, keeping their world and this one safe. For her, he would fight the darkness and he would win. He would vanquish his other side and destroy it for good, would become the complete male he had once been, all so he could be with her. Forever. The end. This has been Esher, Guardians of Hades Romance Series Book 3, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Copyright 2018 by Felicity Heaton. Production copyright 2018 by Felicity Heaton.